J. Drake Hamilton, Fresh Energy's Senior Director of Science Policy and an expert in climate and energy policy at state and national levels. Jay has represented Fresh Energy at 8 global climate summits, including Paris, Glasgow, Dubai, and now Baku. More about her background can be found on our website and chapter newsletter. Jay, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jason. Welcome, everyone. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the 29th Annual Conference of the Parties, or COP, to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Nearly every nation in the world had representatives there, sometimes as many as 1,900 people. It was held on the western shore of the Caspian Sea in the capital city Baku of the country Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan, just for your knowledge, is 9 time zones ahead of us. At COP, it was the second largest COP. It was about 60,000 people, and it was held at a sports stadium, which is par for the course. It was interesting because the president of Azerbaijan, which is a petro state, his name is Aliyev, he had requested that people keep their workforces working from home, and 2/3 of the people who would normally be in the streets were working from home during COP29. And no schools and no universities were open for the full 2 weeks. They were closed. What we noticed was apparently the parents of many of the teenage kids expressed an interest that they be volunteers at the COP. And so there were a lot of teenage kids there, and they were there to get really snazzy jackets in beautiful colors. And I found it very useful because a lot of these kids had really good English skills, and I have no Azerbaijani. And they knew secret ways to get around the COP, shortcuts. Very handy. The biggest disappointment at the COP was that the Azerbaijan officials that hosted the conference hadn't done nearly enough to push forward an ambitious deal in the last 12 months that would build upon the Dubai consensus a year ago that was led by the COP28 president, Sultan Al Jaber, in which 198 countries of the world finally agreed to, quote, transition away from fossil fuels and accelerate decarbonization within the next 10 years. So what the main gist of this COP was we specified in Dubai that the world would triple the world's renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency, but needed to decide what finance would be needed for that and which countries would provide that finance. The United Nations process requires that countries use peer pressure to apply to other countries. And the UN process requires voluntary cooperation among nations with widely different interests. And interestingly, I will refer you or remind you that every country at COP has veto power. So COP only moves forward with consensus. The final deal was muddled, but it did require $300 billion per year in climate finance starting in the year 2035. It also included an aspirational goal that the world's nations would collectively raise $1.3 trillion per year, primarily from private investment. So this COP was called unofficially the Finance COP. That means that it had particular focus on the financial commitments and mechanisms needed to mobilize the trillions of dollars required to address climate change globally. Such levels of investment sound implausible, but they are achievable, and I'll give you a couple of examples in about 10 minutes. And if the world delays much longer, the economic and social losses will greatly pale in comparison. Now, a very important man there was the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. His name is Simon Steele, and he spelled out on the first day what he called the ABCs of nationally determined commitments. So what this is the world's nations are now required to file less than a month from today, on February 10th, 2025, their brand new climate action plan. And it must be much more aggressive. So those plans will get filed on February 10th, 2025, and the ABCs stand for. The A is for ambitious economy-wide emissions targets. So not just on electricity and not just on carbon. The B stands for the plan has to target targets that are broken down into all the sectors of the economy and into all the greenhouse gases. The C stands for the plan needs to include credible regulations, laws, and funding from within their country. So the parties, which are the countries, must unlock accountable, effective climate action and finance. Countries must prioritize creating policy environments that will attract private sector investments, policies that signal certainty to investors. Countries should build climate policy roadmaps for each sector: energy, transportation, agriculture, heavy industry, and provide technical assistance to implement those plans so that they could unlock collectively trillions in local capital that is now sitting on the sidelines. Countries need to build confidence that investments aligned with these priorities are lower risks to their investors. So all these climate action plans, they're called the 3.0 climate action plans. They must address all three pillars of climate action: 1, adaptation; 2, mitigation; and 3, loss and damage. We must continue to have a future that does not end lives and end livelihoods. Countries need to agree on a new finance goal, and financing climate action has to get carbon markets going. We probably need to collect much more than $2 trillion in climate finance. That's what all the economic experts say. In 2024, that means that would be nearly 2 times the investment that were made in 2022 in fossil fuel subsidies. So that means it's possible because we've done it for fossil fuels. Now we have to do it for climate actions. Representatives of US Congress on both sides of the aisle have come to recognize that clean energy is a huge moneymaker and a very impressive job creator. It has created, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act has now created at least 400,000 new jobs in the United States. So we know that we are squarely in the world of trillions of dollars being invested in solutions such as renewable energy and zero emissions transport. Sadly, many countries are also undermining climate investment efforts by continuing to invest in fossil fuels. So finance was a subject that had never before been at the center of a COP. Money. Negotiations about investments in both renewable energy and infrastructure that can protect people from climate-fueled droughts, fires, floods, and sea level rise are on the table. And stronger mechanisms will also be needed to hold all parties, which means all the countries, more accountable. Climate change will bring massive economic and social losses already being experienced. So we have to scale up our climate investments to prevent these losses. We need to be specific in our plans about the next steps, and those next steps need to be far more ambitious. So, what was decided in Baku? The last days and nights of COP29 were pandemonium. It was overtime. The conference was supposed to end on November 22nd at midnight. It ended about 36 hours later because it took that much longer to reach a decision on the consensus text. And parties agreed to the text at about 3 a.m. on Sunday, November 24th, when the COP was then gavel closed. So what that means is no party, that means no country, exercised their right to veto the final text, which was in itself a victory. The two main players were wealthy countries led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union, who were working together, and dozens of delegations from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, especially India, Kenya, and the fast disappearing Pacific Islands, who have so much to lose, were working together. Both sets of players were negotiating day and night, mostly without sleep, for the last 3 to 5 days. Who did they decide should pay up? Well, first of all the developed nations, and then in a win, both China and South Korea will also contribute to climate finance, as rich countries will. However, China and South Korea are still not formally called developed or rich countries. They weren't willing to give that up. So repeating to you, the United Nations process requires peer pressure that one country or a group of countries place on other countries. The process also requires voluntary cooperation among nations with widely different interests. The final deal was muddled, but it did require a tripling to $300 billion per year in climate finance starting in 2035. It included an aspirational goal, I'm repeating again, to collectively raise at least $1.3 trillion per year, primarily from private investment. That is a big deal. So negotiators struck an agreement to triple the flow of money to help developing countries to adopt cleaner energy and cope with the effects of climate change. That was very good. Complaints came from India, which called it a paltry sum. According to Panama's lead negotiator, quote, the process at COP29 was chaotic, poorly managed, and a complete failure in terms of delivering the ambition required. It was an underwhelming victory. We saw more than 2 weeks of divisive debate over who should pay and how much. The resulting $300 billion a year, as you already know, quote, falls far short of the trillion plus figure that the poor countries had sought, unquote. a huge sense of frustration and often anger, especially from many poorer developing nations, of the huge compromises they have been forced to make to ensure the multilateral process survived. But they knew there is no other multilateral process in the world. This is it. If they're going to get any help, this is going to be the place. So independent experts have placed the needs totally for developing countries much higher. And they say there is a multi-trillion-dollar amount that must be invested in the energy transition of low-income countries. However, all the parties agreed that more climate finance money is needed in Baku. The text of climate finance, they agreed, is unsustainable. So they know that they're going to have to go back to the table over the next 12 months before the next COP, and they need to build a pathway forward for more finance money. Now, I want to say a word about raising $1 trillion per year. That is less than 1% of global GDP. The global annual gross domestic product exceeds 100 trillion US dollars. So we have the capacity to reach annual climate investment needs. The amount is not unprecedented. For example, when we went through the COVID-19 emergency, measures to address that exceeded $10 trillion in US dollars globally. So now the world now urgently needs the vision, the ambition, and the political will to address the climate crisis at a similar scale. So some of the good news includes what I saw throughout the conference, that outside the US with our election, outside the US, the rest of the world is racing ahead into the low carbon economy. They are always talking to other countries about what they're doing. In addition, in Baku, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage will begin dispersing finance in 2025. It is being operationalized. It is, in fact, already operational. Also, excellent news. It was also very interesting to listen to what all the very large businesses at COP had to say. Over and over again, many diverse companies said, companies matter as much as countries in their emissions. We need to get companies on an aggressive, faster-paced path. We need to get the other 1,000 biggest companies, and we shouldn't accept commitments to reducing emissions. We need to expect performance accountability from both all countries, but also all these very large companies. So they were aiming to mobilize much needed finance for developing countries. Some people said, well, they eked out an agreement. It was an underwhelming new global deal, but it did provide finance for the most climate vulnerable and for investing in those countries' resilience toward a much more equitable, safer future. It was interesting for me to speak to the woman, Marina Silva. She is Brazilian. She is currently the Minister of the Environmental and Climate Change for Brazil, and she may play a big role in the Brazilian COP in 2030, in 2025, excuse me. Her title is Her Excellency Silva, And she spoke about that this deal reached in Baku led to the Baku to Belém, Brazil roadmap, at which the discussion will be how to raise the rest of the money, at least $1.3 trillion. And many of you know the relatively new president of Brazil, named President Lula, will likely be the president of COP30. Also, what was decided on in Baku was they set out a monitoring process for reform of the multilateral development banks like the World Bank. So that was big news as well. Interestingly, it was the time of 2024 when China's historical greenhouse gas emissions have now overtaken emissions from the European Union. So it was very interesting that one of the biggest delegations at COP was from China. Many years ago, I remembered China would send at most like 50 or 100 or 150 negotiators. This time they sent about 1,900. So at this COP, the US co-led with the Chinese to focus on the principles for transition planning, both at the national level and at the firm level for those big businesses that I described before. Also, most interesting in Baku, it's a 2-week process. Most of the actual negotiations, the sleepless ones, happen in the second week or even beyond the second week. But during the first week, Saudi Arabia was very active in a very bad way. They were trying to remove language from the Dubai text, and this is illegal to do. They tried to remove the language that said we would transition away from fossil fuels. But I'm pleased to announce the Saudis did not prevail. They did not get what they wanted. But also, what was very evident at the COP, not only for those of us Americans there who have just struggled through our latest election and the results, but worsening geopolitical tensions are affecting many parts of the world. In the Middle East, of course, in both Gaza and Israel and other places. And some of the world's leaders that we would normally expect to appear on day 1 and 2 of the COP were not there because politics are going wrong there. In places like, well, the US had a big contingent there, but the presidents of France, Germany, Canada were not there. Argentina is taking such a strong right turn that on day 2 of the COP, they demanded that their whole delegation come home from Baku, and they did. So that's going to be hard, but it was said by many smart people there. They said that these political derailments will not derail the pathway to scaling finance for the climate transition. But they stressed that we need to see broader, credible, much more ambition. And I will note one final fixed feature inspires hope in me rather than dread or resignation. And that fact is that every year, renewable energy gets cheaper, especially solar panels. Every year, the installed base grows. Last year, China added more solar capacity at home than the whole world could boast in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed. That is remarkable progress. As rollouts get bigger of renewable energy, prices drop lower and larger rollouts become feasible. This is the change that you can rely on. And that's what economists tell us, including at the International Energy Agency. It provides reason to believe that the world is not as stuck as it seems. Emissions can and will fall more. Economic modeling has routinely underestimated the rate at which solar panels, batteries, and wind turbines can get cheaper. So, estimates of the cost of decarbonizing the energy system are routinely too high. The difference between A, the annual investment needed to meet new energy demand with clean technology, and B, without it, appear to be under 1% of all countries' GDP. In other words, it is affordable, but much of that money is not in government's hands. It is in the private investment sector. So I also think a lot about poor countries and talked about them very routinely in Baku. Poor countries in which capital is costly need our help. Renewables have higher capital costs and lower operating costs than technologies which have to buy fuel, and that hurts people without ready access to finance. Rich countries like ours have moral and pragmatic reasons to provide financial help to the global south. Interestingly, I read a remark from former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon wrote just after Baku. He wrote, tackling climate change is an enormously difficult task. It requires overhauling the world's power plants, the world's cars, the world's factories. And we have to do this often using technologies that barely exist today. And he reminded us, even the best designed UN summit can only play a small role in the largest process. No one single COP can deliver the full transformation that every nation needs. Most of the work will be done at the country level, the level of each of 200 countries. And it will be done by policymakers and engineers and scientists in individual countries. That's the way the UN is designed to work. The Paris Agreement, which celebrated its 9th anniversary today, was a giant positive market signal. The Paris Agreement, and on top of that, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US have delivered trillions of dollars of investment. And in the US, most of that investment, upwards of 80% of the investment, has gone to red states in the United States. So the COP29, what is called the Baku Finance Deal, is a down payment for a safe, equitable future. $300 billion per year to developing countries by 2035, triple the current finance goal, is indeed a big deal. But we need to go farther. And so people are routinely now using the term the Baku to Belém pathway. We need to get on it. We need to prove out that the negotiations in Brazil, about 11 months from today, must be successful in providing trillions of dollars. All right. Now I'm going to leave. I think I've left enough for 10 or 15 minutes of questions. And I know that Jason will help me read them if they're in chats. Or perhaps Jason can call on someone if they
Yeah.
raise their hand?
So yeah, it's up to you guys. If you want to type a question in the chat, I'll go ahead and read it. Otherwise, if you want to make a question directly, raise your virtual hand. Then I'll call on you. We can unmute and go from there. So the floor is open. Questions?
Yeah, please ask away. I know a lot more than I've spoken about.
All right. I think Debbie, you have a question?
Yeah, so mine are always personal. So you've been going to them for a long time. Have you made friends with other countries or made connections that are powerful that you used, when you get back home and you're converse with them or?
Yes, I've made lots of friends. And I started off, this was my 9th COP. My first one was in Montreal in 2005. That was about 12,000 people, much smaller. And at the first meeting I was at, to a group of 300 people, we actually went around the room and introduced ourselves for about 20 seconds. And I had mentioned that I was from Minnesota. There were people from 198 countries. And a bunch of these people came up to me afterwards and said, "We heard you're from Minnesota. We want to have coffee with you." And then what they said when they had coffee with me over the next 2 weeks, they said, they demonstrated to me they know a lot about the geography of the world. I'm a geographer, but they know even more about the political geography of the United States. And what they said to me is, "We know that you're an American, but we know that you're from Minnesota. And we want to stress that we know in the US, you're never going to get a read on what the US Congress is going to do based on what happens in the very left coast of California or even the very progressive parts of Massachusetts. The only thing that matters is what happens in purple states, which can demonstrate to the Congress, give them the chutzpah that they're going to try to pass stronger climate laws." And back in 2005, everyone from around the world was talking about 4 states. And they were talking about Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan. And recently, in the beginning of his term, President Biden was talking about those same 4 states. And he said, "I know that these states are purple states and they matter a huge deal." And he was proved right, because now the first state in climate action is Minnesota, because Minnesota had a great trifecta in the legislature and had people who, believe it or not, I'm going to remind you what happened in 2023 in the Minnesota legislative session. Minnesota passed 46 new clean energy and climate action policies and paid for them. And the first step they took, and it was something that me and my colleagues at Fresh Energy had tried to get the legislature to pass starting in 2020. We said, "You better put together a pool of money that you'll use to match federal money that's going to come available." Because every dollar of federal money is going to require a little bit of a state match. And the Minnesota legislature did that. And now Minnesota is well ahead of many of the states, not all of them, but I've made a lot of friends. And one of those friends I met at COPS is a woman I saw again in Baku. And I'm going to tell you her story. She and I grew up about 40 miles away from each other when we were growing up. I was living in New York in a town of 5,000 people. She was living in a bigger town about 40 miles away in New Jersey. Her name is Jennifer Morgan. She, for a long time, was doing climate action like I was doing in Washington, D.C. And then about 10 years ago, she took her German speaking skills, moved to Germany, became the leader of the biggest climate group in Germany. And now she is representing Germany. She is an American citizen. She is representing Germany in its negotiations. And I got to talk to her as she was doing shuttle negotiations. And she had to go back and forth between other countries in the EU and to the Saudis. And she is one of the reasons they backed down from their position. So I still know a lot of people, and that's really great to have in your quiver when you go to COP. But it's also really important to focus on going to hear the people speak who you think are persuading the most people, because they're going to have an outsized, hopefully an outsized level of influence. Thank you for the question, Debbie.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, Robert, I think you are next, and then Bill after that.
Hi, my name is Robert Woods. I'm co-chair of the Central Minnesota chapter. I've been specializing in what's called environmental justice, which we morphed into environmental solutions. We have a different idea in Minnesota. It's very, very unique. Our idea is that we want to concentrate on climate change finance. And so what we've come up with is an idea to participate and integrate the people who live in urban and rural areas into the Minnesota regional economy using climate change technology as an economic stimulus. And so what I want to know is, and there are amazing parallelisms between the plight of I'm obviously Black American and Native Americans, and the situation that we find ourselves in America, similar to developing countries. Can you talk about any of the financial modeling that came about from the conference? Now, I'm an old investment banker, and I ran a community-based loan and venture capital fund. So I look at so-called environmental justice a lot differently than the other folks. I look at it in terms of financial modeling, and what's really wrong with our community is that the people in it are broke. They don't have any money. They're not making any money. And what we see, environmental justice, environmental solutions, climate change is as an economic stimulus. How can we in America, with the incoming administration, prepare ourselves for 2025, 2026? Because, and lastly, I believe that Saudi Arabia and lots of the corporations are really trying to slow down climate change because their organizations have not figured out how to capitalize on it. Thank you.
Robert, I look forward to meeting you in person. I've seen you on one of these screens in the past month, so I feel like I know you a tiny bit. Thank you for asking the question. First, I want to give you two examples of two other Minnesotans who were at COP29. Two of
Okay.
the first ones I met. One of them I've known for many years. And these are both Black men in powerful positions. One is Jamez Staples. He's the head of Renewable Energy Partners.
He lives across the street from me.
Yeah. And he was speaking all over the COP. And I've known him for about 5 or 6 years. But someone I hadn't met was the mayor of Brooklyn Park, Minnesota.
African guy.
Hollis Winston.
Yeah.
He's the mayor of the fourth largest city in Minnesota. He was also speaking all over the conference. Both of them were speaking about different components of helping make sure that the younger people in their communities can benefit from the climate change technology. And they're both working very hard to make this happen. And they are also being supported both directly and indirectly by many members from both parties of the Minnesota legislature, who in 2023, when they were busy passing these 47 new laws, almost every committee discussion I saw votes held in, there were people from both parties talking about, we need to make sure that the most disadvantaged communities benefit from what we're investing in this. And they were essentially talking about what President Biden had named EJ40. And they were talking about it even deeper in Minnesota. And I was very, very, very proud of that. And now what we're trying to do is set up and make sure that Minnesota is transparent about who is getting the climate investments.
Okay.
What percentage of those are from disadvantaged communities? And it should be higher than 40%. And the people, you also asked a side question about, or maybe the main question, about who is modeling the economics of this. And the ones I look to are coming out of the International Energy Agency and IRENA and many others. And many of these economists are saying what I heard coming out of our lead negotiator last year's mouth many times, and he's John Kerry. And he has told every audience he's been speaking to at COPs for the last 7 or 8 years, he says, most of this new money is going to come from private investments. So we need to focus there. And we need to solve the problem to make these would-be investors take the risk and don't feel that it's as much a risk to invest in less developed countries and less developed communities in our own country. So,
well, Ms. Hamilton, I just want a quick follow-up from that,
please.
and I'm not going to dominate any more time, but I want to say that that financial modeling, and I know both of the guys that you're talking about live a block and a half right across the street, maybe 50 yards from Jemez, and know the guy from Brooklyn Park. But what I'm suggesting to you is something different.
Okay. Go
I
ahead.
think that this chapter, and thank God that many of the chapter leaders, Jason and Tim, have allowed me to move forward in lobbying the U.S. Congress, Minnesota State Congress, and finding out and developing the modeling that it takes to make inner city and urban, as well as rural areas, take advantage of the economic opportunities of climate change technology and commerce. And that is what we really want to make Minnesota into in the Central Minnesota chapter. We think that we have to shift gears. Let's just face it, the world has changed in the United States. We have to shift gears from so-called social justice into economic opportunity as the decision maker. And I think that what you're saying is very clear, that that is what the world wants. That modeling is available, and believe it or not, it's going to come out of this chapter and out of Minnesota, just like you think it is. And what we have is 20 years and 25 years of research. We don't want to get put into a mix of economic justice, and now all of a sudden, since Trump's in, there's no more dollars and it's going to get cut. I don't believe that. In other words, I think that it presents an opportunity to work with the Republicans and the Democrats. And believe it or not, I'm not an advocate, but I am an investment banker, financial planner, and financial executives. And I have no problem working with Trump, Biden, Obama, Nixon, any of them.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
I look forward
Thank
to
you, sir.
talking to you more later.
All righty. Bill Middlecamp, you are up, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Jay. About a year or two ago, you were at this group and there was discussion about nuclear energy. And you made the comment that the best place to store nuclear waste is northern Minnesota. I'm wondering if you have any
I
more
wasn't
thoughts.
advocating for that, though.
No, I know you weren't.
Yes.
I know you weren't. It was a ice bath for the people in the audience, I think, to hear that news. I'm wondering if there's discussion, if you can bring us up to date. There's I think, ever increasing discussion about nuclear, and I was wondering what people around the world are saying about it. And I recognize that this is only one small piece. That electricity is only a portion of what we have to address, but there's a lot of attention is going to nuclear these days. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, when I heard a COP, one of the most interesting people I went to hear speak like 7 times was our Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm. And she was speaking at the U.S. Center, that is a huge pavilion run by the federal government. And one day, I think over 4 or 5 days, Secretary Granholm came by to this pavilion for like 7 hours to talk about 7 different ideas. And one of those was nuclear. And she brought with her enough people from other countries, and they just reached a pact to invest in some new pilot projects for new nuclear. And these were countries, African countries, Asian countries, and Latin American countries, and European countries. And I think what she was trying to say is, which I think is accurate, is that we're going to still need to investigate more than renewable energy and more than energy efficiency to solve this problem. And so we're going to need to fund more pilot projects. And we're going to need to bite the bullet and be aware that not all pilot projects are successful. But I think what I like to say about these is that the thing to get us through is transparency. And I like to see more and more legislators in Minnesota talk about transparency of where the clean energy and climate money is going. And I think this pertains to piloting new nuclear investments, is to make it very clear what these pilot projects are unearthing and what answers they're finding. Even if the pilot project does not appear successful, it is very valuable to everyone else to learn what they found might be successful and might not be ready yet, because we need to share information. And I'm going to change my focus just briefly away from nuclear power, Bill, to talk about electricity, because what I see going on in Minnesota is very interesting. The best project going on in Minnesota related to energy right now is that Sherco 1, 2, and 3, which until recently were the largest source of greenhouse gases in Minnesota. They are the 3 largest coal plants in Minnesota. One of them has now closed. By 2030, they will no longer be burning coal. And what they are replacing that coal with is a combination of solar panels on the site of a coal plant, former coal plant, specifically located there, solar panels and wind turbines and long duration batteries. And so Sherco 1, 2, and 3, which used to be a very large and very dirty coal plant, by 2030 will be a very large and very clean solar, wind, and long-term battery plant. And what I love about those batteries, and Excel has invested its money in this, and it's gone to Bill Gates and raised money from Bill Gates, and then it got a bigger loan from the U.S. Department of Energy, from Secretary Granholm. And these long-term batteries were developed by MIT engineers, and the MIT spun off this company, which is now called Form Energy. And I wish I had brought one slide with me. I don't own this slide yet, but I will eventually own this slide. Form 1 is building iron air batteries. I bet there are people on this call who are very concerned about the toxicity of most batteries, not iron air batteries, and not especially if the iron will preferentially be sourced from the iron ore in Minnesota. And air is just air, and iron is so everywhere and so numerous, and air is plenty. And these iron air batteries, the first factory that builds the factories has been built. Guess what Form Energy has named it? Factory 1, which tells you that they expect to have many more batteries. Factory 1 now exists and is manufacturing 500 long duration batteries in West Virginia. And why do I love talking about that in Minnesota? Because the iron and the utilities involved are in Minnesota. But I come from a family. My father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather grew up in the geographical center of West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And what did my grandfather do? My grandfather drove the coal train. Mm-hmm. And what that means, this Form 1 factory will eventually hire 650 West Virginians and will pay them much higher than the average state wage for men, and especially much higher state wage for women. Isn't that great news? Mm. And I've proposed this in many talks around Minnesota. I say, when you think about Minnesota and you think about West Virginia now being connected by these batteries, we are essentially building a bridge between the very different places. We need to have many more conversations like this. And the reason I spent so much time talking about this example is I know that the contract number 1 will bring these iron air batteries to the Great River Energy part of Minnesota. And the second place to get it will be Xcel Energy. And I'm going to get to see it in 2025. You should call on me when I have pictures to bring back, which I will in the first or second quarter of 2025. I think this can be an exemplar for all of us in this country. Let's stop being a separate country. Let's talk about how we can work together to make this country even better for everyone.
Oh, thank you.
And I think we now have to we now have to cut off this question and answer, Jason.
Yeah, I
because
think
we've
we're at
asked
the,
for
yep,
the final few minutes. Thank you all very much.
Thank
Hey,
you.
thank you.
yep. So
And if you want
round of
to
applause.
reach me, my email, hamilton@ fresh-energy.org. Please get in touch. I'll come have coffee with you. I'll come have lunch with you and talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Way to go, Jason.
All right.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
we're near the bottom of the hour. However, I think we might have just enough time for an action alert. What do you think, Anna?
Yes, so let me get that pasted into the chat. Yeah, so with the results of the recent election, most environmental groups are focusing their efforts on local initiatives rather than national initiatives. So tonight we're going to have a local environmental action. And also timely, the monarch butterfly was just proposed to be added to the endangered species list. And one of the pesticides contributing to their decline is neonics. And in Minnesota, these pesticides are commonly used on farming seeds and sold at stores like Home Depot as part of a cocktail of lawn products. And so while there may be some valid uses for them, they're far too commonly used today. And so we're asking the Minnesota Department of Agriculture to more tightly regulate their use. So please click on that action and just sign the petition and let our Department of Agriculture know that this matters to you.
Thank you, Anna. Again, thanks for joining us. Be sure to join us next month. So on Thursday, January 16th with Tina Clark. She'll be discussing community resilience. So be sure to look out for the official invite. Otherwise, on behalf of the leadership team here at the Central Minnesota chapter of the Climate Reality Project, thank you for attending.